I actually think you could make the argument today that AI is very much headquartered here in San Francisco. And if you're building something innovative in AI, you should be here. I'm not saying you have to move everything here, but like you're missing something if you're not here, right? We're a little unique in that we are an independent fund. So we're financially driven. We're not, there's no strategic element here. We're not a family office in that sense. We really do, we have that 2 and 20 model. We're quite independent in that sense. So
Keshia, so thank you so much for being here. So the reason why I got a wonderful opportunity to interview Keshia today was I met you the talk event. It was last week, right? Startup grind. Yeah, it was good. And so could you please quick introduce about yourself?
yes. How deep do you want me to go? Okay, so I'm super excited to be here. This is wonderful. The event we met at was specifically for female founders, right? So focusing on women. As you know, women don't get a lot of funding. I think about 2% of all venture capital dollars go to 2%. Go to startups that have at least one woman founder. This could be outdated, but I want to say 11 or 12% of all venture capitalists are women. So also better numbers, but still pretty low. And I think it's a really cool group to support. Obviously, I'm also a woman. So my journey to venture capital was unusual, or maybe somewhat usual. I think a lot of people get into venture either, yes, you go through the business school, internship, venture capital, or another common path is that you found a company, right? And you learn about entrepreneurship operationally and then join a VC fund. That's what I did. So I grew up in Kentucky, did my undergrad there, moved to Southeast Asia. I lived in Laos.
Laos? Laos is next to Thailand.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, I was there for about a year and a half. Yeah. Working in like the education and geospace. Yeah, which is very cool. I actually met my now husband on the way, and he had just finished his MBA, and he's Dutch, and I had stopped to visit a friend in the Netherlands, and I met him, and he didn't have a job yet, right? He was just graduated, and I was like, hey, I'm moving to Laos, and you could I was in my early 20s, and I was like, you can apply for jobs from Laos. Come hang out with me. And he did, and we got married there.
In Laos?
In Thailand.
Thailand.
And then we had a big party in Laos. So, needless to say, he did not find great jobs in Laos. After about a year and a half, we moved back. And we moved to the Netherlands. So I was there for 3.5 years or more. Did all my graduate work there. Groningen. Yeah, which is, you've never heard of it. It's like 2 hours north of Amsterdam, kind of on the North Sea, like on the German border. And it's beautiful, but it is a university city. So there's not a lot of other things like the university. Boston's much bigger. Much bigger, yeah. I think Groningen probably definitely has less than 1 million people. Yeah, so it's very cute. Yeah. But I lived there for a while, did all my graduate work, moved out to Silicon Valley 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago. And when we moved, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I had a lot of different interests and was chasing different things.
Why did you move to Silicon Valley?
My husband's job. Yeah, like I found myself here. It was not, it wasn't necessarily intentional. I met this guy who was doing his postdoc at Stanford. He was an elementary school principal. And this was when Edtech was the hottest industry in Silicon Valley at the time.
Hottest?
Yeah.
Hottest.
Yeah. Not today. I think it turns out that education, so at the time, remember Coursera? I mean, it's still around. those types of companies were getting funding, and everyone was excited about education. There's not a lot of money in education, unfortunately, and so a lot of those big bets didn't pay off. But I started an Edtech company, and we couldn't make money. We ended up making it a nonprofit. So that was an important part of my journey. I learned a lot. And then from there, I got hired by an investor. So I was at GSV Labs. So GSV Capital was a big Edtech, like one of the biggest Edtech funds here in the Valley at the time.
They still have in here.
For now. I hear through the grapevine that they may not raise another fund, but they have been in Silicon Valley they're an institution. Yes, yeah, they've been around for a really long time. Great team. GSV Labs is going really well. They rebranded recently to One Valley, so you may know the team there. But yeah, so I joined there. I was their director of strategic partnerships. So working with a lot of startups, working with also large corporations to instill like startup best practices for big companies, a lot of startup scouting. So worked with companies like Fujifilm and 3M and others to connect them with startups that they, across a ton of different industries. From there, got recruited to run a startup accelerator. So I did that for a few years. I've been at BDev Ventures now for over 3 years. We've been actively investing for about 3.5. And BDev is we're a relatively new fund, but we're very active. So we invest in B2B software. We're minority investors. We prefer not to lead rounds. We've been actively investing for 3.5 years. And in that time, we already have over 80 investments across 59 portfolio companies. So volume, we actually last month made 7 investments, which in the venture capital world is a lot. It felt like a lot. And we invest kind of late seed, right? Pre-Series A through Series B. We prefer to follow on. We love follow-on investing and supporting our champions. And we, in addition to capital, provide all of our portfolio companies with access to lead gen platforms. And so basically, through a few different tools, we're replacing SDRs. So we're giving them like real leads, real revenue. Right now, we make up somewhere between 6 and 65% of all new revenue for our portcos. Sorry, that was a very long introduction. So we have 4 partners at the fund. So Fund 1 was $150 million. We're a single LP fund. So a group of co-founders from a company called BDev are single LP. So all of our capital that we're investing is coming from them today. That's changing as we grow. But today they're amazing. Nacho DeMarco is the founder of BDev. Has a super, super successful founder. Today he's a billionaire. He lives here in San Francisco. So everyone on the leadership team actually has true operational experience within startups, which drives, I think, a lot of our, especially from Nacho DeMarco, but from all of us, it really drives that like, hey, we're not just here to invest capital. We're really here to help you build.
I see. So BDev Ventures has one LP. Is this like a super usual, or other VC firm has like several LPs?
It's not super common. It happens, like we see it sometimes. And there's a few different structures for funds. Let's break that down. So most VC funds, like a typical VC fund, is set up in what we call a 2 and 20 model. So they get all the money from LPs. They take 2%, so the 2, in management fees. So if you raise $100 million, $100, 2 of those dollars or $2 million of those dollars are going to come to the fund manager as a way to pay for the activities of the fund. And then the 2 and 20 model, the 20 is carried interest. So the partners at the fund and maybe others at the fund get the interest in what they earn. And it can be more complicated, but that's a kind of basic traditional venture fund. Some funds, if you are fundraising, it's typical, I would say almost all funds are going to have multiple LPs, and it's not uncommon to have many, especially if you have multiple funds. So it can be, and actually we have some new rules now in the SEC that allow for hundreds of LPs theoretically. Typically it's more a handful, right? 10, 20. Single LP is unusual, and it's also unusual because we're not a family office, right? So family offices are really interesting. So it tends to be one or two families, pool their money, they're investing in startups, maybe they're investing in funds as LPs. But it's different in that they're oftentimes strategic, or they're driven by the desires of the family. So they're not necessarily always focused on financial returns, or maybe not only focused on financial returns. That's also true for corporate funds. So the other like single LP structure is a corporate fund, right? So corporations have their own VCs. They also tend to be maybe not focused on financial returns. Maybe it's more strategic, or not only focused on financial returns. We're a little unique in that we are an independent fund. So we're financially driven. We're not, there's no strategic element here. We're not a family office in that sense. We really do, we have that 2 and 20 model. We're quite independent in that sense. So it is unusual. Yeah.
Okay, so Keshia, the reason why I asked about it, because I come from Japan. There are many big corporate, maybe you knew it. Japanese company culture, we are risk averse. So we don't do kind of bold decision. But I assume your firm is so BDev Ventures successful, and then focusing on only late stage B2B SaaS, right? Maybe Japanese company want to become your partner, or like other LP. Yeah. If they come to, hey, Keshia, can we talk? What do you think?
Yes. So we're not actively fundraising today. However, yes, the answer is always yes. Like, I'm always happy to take those conversations. And we, in the future, I think there's an interesting opportunity for us. As our portfolio progresses and matures, we have really big investment rights in some of our companies. And if they're continuing to be successful, we want to support them. At the same time, we write checks up to $3 million, right? We've maybe we could go a little higher. Our largest check to date is $3 million. We can't necessarily, as some of these companies are raising maybe a big Series B and certainly Series C, we may have the allocation and the ability to write a $10 million check, but we only write $3 million. So for us, partnering with other LPs, maybe through an SPV or maybe in the future a dedicated fund, gives us the opportunity to still write those big checks and make sure that we're supporting our portfolio. At the same time, for LPs, they get to invest in companies maybe they wouldn't have access to otherwise. It's very noisy on the street today.
I see. Thank you so much. So you used to work at the Accelerator, right? It was German Accelerator, correct? Could you please share about it?
Yeah. German Accelerator is so cool. It is, and Japan also has JETRO, which is a very similar program, I think. So at German Accelerator, we took high potential European startups and launched them into the US market. I started off running their Silicon Valley programs and eventually ran their US programs. So I had a team in Silicon Valley and a team in New York. We would work with companies anywhere from 6 months to a year and a half or sometimes even more. And it was non-dilutive. So we weren't, there was some investment potential. We had deep relationships with a few investors, but the program itself, just to participate in the program, we didn't take any equity.
Really?
Yeah, which is pretty cool. And my understanding is JETRO is very similar, that it's the government's funding. Yeah, you're right. And they, I assume, have very deep relationships with investors and made themselves invest, right? But the program itself is free if you can get in. And German Accelerator is pretty competitive, and I'm sure JETRO has some competition. I know there's an application process. But these types of programs that give you, we were talking earlier about living here in San Francisco, office space is expensive. And whether it's German Accelerator or Jetro, you get free office space, you get free mentoring, you get a place to kind of land softly and people who will make introductions for you and support you, and even little things. Like you're here, you've lived in a foreign country, as have I. It can be difficult if you don't have a group of people around you to even know, like, well, what neighborhoods are good neighborhoods? Where should I grocery shop? We were talking earlier about Trader Joe's, right? But if you're coming here from Japan or Germany, that's not obvious. Like, how would I know that, right? So having that soft landing, I think, is really valuable.
I see. Thank you so much. So for 3 years, you helped to grow the German Accelerator. Wow. So what was the takeaway? Because of, I can imagine every single program you had met many kind of beginner founders, right? Yeah. So it's totally different compared to current situation, right?
Yeah. Yes. So we worked with sometimes very early stage, right? If there's a reason for, and there are certain industries like autonomous vehicles. If you are working in autonomous vehicles, you need to be here, right? Maybe Boston or Arizona at one point. I don't know if that's still relevant, but there are certain industries where you just have to be in the US from day one. I actually think you could make the argument today that AI is very much headquartered here in San Francisco. And if you're building something innovative in AI, you should be here. I'm not saying you have to move everything here, but like you're missing something if you're not here, right? For me, so we really grew the program. When I started, we had a cohort. The cohort before I started had one startup. Just one in the entire cohort. It was just one.
Really?
Yeah, my last cohort, we accepted 45. So really ramped it up because we completely redid the program and how we thought about launching startups into the US. The US market is in my opinion, for most startups, it's going to be the hardest market. It's by far the most expensive, right? But it's the biggest opportunity. And if you're going to be a global company and you're going to get those investment dollars, those big rounds, you need to have a plan for the US. So it's vital.
At the time, you are everyone's teacher who provide education and kind of cheerleader, right? So super hustle. And now you are talking with not super beginner founder because of late stage experienced founders, right? So why did you change like kind of your perspective is not early stage, more experienced founders?
Yeah. We still invest in like late seed, right? So still somewhat early. It's a good question. I loved the Accelerator and I still regularly make introductions for them and can only say nice things. But the truth is it's a little cyclical, right? There's every cohort is a little bit similar. The people change and I love working with the different companies. But over time, you're answering a lot of the same questions. Yeah. And so at some point I felt like I wasn't learning so much, right? Like when I first joined, I felt like I was learning, like we have a saying here in the US, drinking from the fire hose, right? Where you're just like, you're learning constantly. Yeah. And there's amazing people all the time. And over time that slowed down for me, which is normal and should happen with a job, right? Like at some point you're like, okay, like I've been doing this long enough. I have some expertise. BDev Ventures they reached out to me and it was such a unique opportunity. And I was so excited about what they were building that it was kind of the perfect timing for me. I was, open to thinking about something new. And then a perfect opportunity for me to kind of lean on my business experience, my venture experience, but also still work with startups in a meaningful way. And I think the combination's been really fun. I'm still learning here, so I'll be here for a while.
The 3 key takeaways from Conversation with Keshia, Part 1. 1. Real-world experience built her VC lens. Keshia didn't go to business school to become a VC. She lived the founder journey. She moved to Laos and she started the Edtech startup, leading startup program at German Accelerator and GSV Labos. She learned what early-stage founders really need: mentorship, market fit, and mental resilience. Example, she once scaled a cohort from just one startup to 45 by redesigning the entire accelerator model. That kind of operator mindset shaped how she now supports portfolio companies as a VC. 2. BDev Ventures, high-volume VC backed by a single LP. Keshia is now a partner at BDev Ventures, at a fast-moving VC fund with a unique model backed by a single successful founder. Invested in 59 plus companies with 80 plus checks in just 3.5 years. Focused on B2B software at late seed to Series B. Example, their fund help startups by providing tools that generate real sales lead instead of hiring junior sales reps. The tools directly help startups find new customers and grow revenue. 3. Why she moved from Accelerator to late stage VC. Keshia loved helping beginner founders, but after years of repeating the same early stage guidance, she craved growth too. Now at BDev, she worked with experienced founders and complex growth stage challenges, learning new things every day. Lesson: growth isn't just for startups. Founders are the only ones who pivot. VCs evolve too. Okay? Thank you so much for watching our episode today. We hope today's conversation will help your future and career. The next episode is the conversation with Keshia Part 2. Please stay tuned. Thank you so much. Bye bye. またね。チャオ。